wasn't till the beginning of September 1914 that Ashenden, a writer by profession, who'd been abroad at the outbreak of the war, managed to get back to England. Soon after his arrival, he chanced to go to a party where he was introduced to a middle-aged colonel whose name he didn't catch. He had some talk with him. As he was about to leave, this officer came up to him. "I say, I wonder if you'd mind coming to see me. I'd rather like to have a chat with you." "Certainly," said Ashenden. "Whenever you like." "What about tomorrow at 11? When Ashenden walked along next morning to keep his appointment, he found, on the house at which he'd been asked to call, a board announcing that it was for sale. The shutters were closed, and there was no sign that anyone lived in it. He rang the bell, and the door was opened by a non-commissioned officer so promptly that he was startled. He was led immediately into a long room at the back, once evidently a dining room, but now sparsely fitted out as an office. The colonel, who, as Ashenden later discovered, was known in the intelligence department by the letter R, rose when he came in and shook hands with him. Lean, with a deeply lined face, thin grey hair and a toothbrush moustache, the thing immediately noticeable about him was the closeness with which his blue eyes were set. They were hard, cruel eyes, and very wary, and they gave him a cunning, shifty look. He was a man that you could neither like nor trust at first sight. His manner, though, was pleasant and cordial. He asked Ashenden a good many questions, and then, without further ado, suggested that he had particular qualifications for the Secret Service. Ashenden was acquainted with several European languages, and his profession was excellent cover. On the pretext that he was writing a book, he could, without attracting attention, visit any neutral country. It didn't take them long to settle things, and when Ashenden rose to go, he'd already made careful note of his instructions. He was to start for Geneva next day. The last words that R said to him were, "There's just one thing you ought to know, and don't forget it. If you do well, you'll get no thanks, and if you get into trouble, you'll get no help. Does that suit you?" "Perfectly." "Then I wish you good afternoon." Ashenden hadn't been in post very long when, one day at about 5 in the afternoon, an Indian agent of his came to see him in his hotel. It was only by chance that he was in, for he had no appointment with him, and the agent's instructions were to come to the hotel only in an emergency. He told Ashenden that a Bengali in the German service had recently arrived in Switzerland from Berlin. He'd come with a black cane trunk containing documents of vital interest to the British government. At that time, Germany was doing its best to foment trouble in India, so that Britain would have to keep its troops in the country and perhaps send others from France. Ashenden's agent had managed to get the Bengali arrested in Bern on a charge that would keep him out of harm's way for a while, but he'd been unable to get his hands on the black cane trunk. What Ashenden's agent had discovered was that, before going to Bern, the Bengali had left the trunk in the cloakroom at Zurich station. He still had the receipt needed to redeem it, but now that he was in jail awaiting trial, was unable to get it to any of his confederates. The German intelligence department had to get their hands on the contents of the trunk without delay, and they decided to break into the station that very night and steal it. In this bold scheme, Ashenden recognized the dashing and unscrupulous touch of the head of the German Secret Service at Bern. But the burglary was arranged for 2 o'clock the following morning, and there wasn't a moment to lose. He could trust neither the telegraph nor the telephone to communicate with the British officer at Bern. The Indian agent couldn't go. He was taking his life in his hands by coming to see Ashenden. There was nothing for it but to go himself. There was a train to Bern that he could just catch, and he put on his hat and coat as he ran downstairs. He jumped into a cab. 4 hours later, he rang the bell of the headquarters of the intelligence department. A tall, tired-looking man, whom he hadn't met before, came out and led him into an office. Ashenden told him his errand. The tall man looked at his watch. "It's too late for us to do anything ourselves. We couldn't possibly get to Zurich in time," he reflected. "We'll put the Swiss authorities on the job. They can telephone to Zurich, and when your friends attempt their little burglary, I've no doubt they'll find the station well guarded. Anyhow, you better get back to Geneva." As they shook hands, Ashenden was well aware that he'd never know what happened next. Being no more than a tiny rivet in a vast and complicated machine, he never had the advantage of seeing the results of his work. On his way back to Geneva, the night was stormy, and the wind blew cold from the mountains, but the little steamer plodded sturdily through the choppy waters of the lake. A scudding rain, just turning into sleet, swept the deck in angry gusts. Notwithstanding his fur coat and muffler, Ashenden was chilled to the bone. It was warm in the saloon, but he thought it better not to sit there in case some habitual traveller, recognizing him, wondered why he made these constant journeys between Geneva in Switzerland and Thonon in France. And so, making the best of what shelter could be found, he passed the tedious time in the darkness of the deck. He made up his mind that, on getting back to his hotel, he'd have a fire lit in his sitting room, a hot bath, and dinner comfortably by the fireside in pyjamas and a dressing gown. The prospect of an evening with his pipe and a book was so agreeable that it made the misery of that journey across the lake positively worthwhile. Two sailors tramped past him heavily, their heads bent to save themselves from the sleet that blew in their faces, and one of them shouted to him, "Nous arrivons!" Through the howling darkness, Ashenden saw mistily the lights of the quay. A welcome sight. In 2 or 3 minutes the steamer was made fast, and Ashenden, muffled to the eyes, joined himself to the little knot of passengers waiting to step ashore. And though he made the journey so often, it was his duty to cross the lake into France once a week to deliver his reports and receive instructions. He always felt a faint sense of trepidation when he stood among the crowd at the gangway waiting to land. The problem was that there was nothing on his passport to show that he'd been in France. The steamer went round the lake, touching French soil at 2 places, but going from Switzerland to Switzerland, so that his journey might have been to Vevey or to Lausanne. But if he'd been followed by the secret police and seen to land in France, the fact that there was no stamp on his passport would be difficult to explain. Of course, he had his story ready, but he knew that it wasn't very convincing. He might have to spend 2 or 3 days in jail, which would be uncomfortable, and then be firmly conducted to the frontier, which would be mortifying. The Swiss knew well that their country was the scene of all manner of intrigues. Secret service agents, spies, revolutionaries and agitators infested the hotels of the principal towns, and jealous of their neutrality, the Swiss were determined to avoid getting embroiled with any of the belligerent powers. There were, as usual, 2 police officers on the quay to watch the passengers disembark, and Ashenden, walking past them with as unconcerned an air as he could assume, was relieved when he'd got safely by. The darkness swallowed him up, and he stepped out briskly for his hotel. It was hail now that blew in Ashenden's face, and the pavement was so wet and slippery that he had to walk with caution. The hotel faced the lake. When he reached it and a page boy opened the door for him, he entered the hall with a flurry of wind that sent the papers on the porter's desk flying. Ashenden stopped to ask the porter if there were letters for him. There was nothing, and he was about to get into the lift when the porter told him that 2 gentlemen were waiting in his room to see him. "Oh," he said, not a little surprised. "Who are they?" He'd taken care to get on friendly terms with the porter, and his tips for trifling services had been generous. The porter gave a discreet smile. "I think they're the police." "What do they want?" asked Ashenden. "They didn't say." "How long have they been there?" "An hour." "I'll go up and see them." The liftman stood aside to let him step into the lift, but Ashenden shook his head. I'm so cold, I'll walk up." He wished to give himself a moment to think, but as he ascended the 3 flights slowly, his feet were like lead. There could be small doubt why 2 police officers were so bent upon seeing him. He suddenly felt dreadfully tired, and unable to cope with a multitude of questions. And if he were arrested as a secret agent, he'd have to spend the night in a cell. He longed more than ever for a hot bath and a pleasant dinner by his fireside. He had half a mind to turn tail and walk out of the hotel, leaving everything behind him. He had his passport in his pocket, and he knew by heart the hours at which trains started for the frontier. Before the Swiss authorities had made up their minds what to do, he'd be in safety. But he continued to trudge upstairs. He didn't like the notion of abandoning his job so easily. He'd been sent to Geneva knowing the risks, and it seemed to him that he'd better go through with it. Of course, it wouldn't be very nice to spend 2 years in a Swiss prison, but the risk was one of the inconveniences of this profession. His spirits rose, and as he reached the landing of the 3rd floor and stood for a moment outside his door, he determined to brazen the thing out. It was with a genuine smile on his lips that he turned the handle, and entering the room, faced his visitors. "Good evening, gentlemen," he said. The room was brightly lit, and a fire burned in the hearth. Nevertheless, the strangers sat in their greatcoats and bowler hats, as though they'd only just that moment come in. They were 2 powerful men with black moustaches, heavily built, and they reminded Ashenden of the giants in the Rheingold, Fafner and Fasolt. Ashenden gave his room an enveloping glance. He was a neat creature and saw at once that his things, though not in disorder, weren't as he'd left them. That didn't disturb him, for he kept nothing in his room document that would compromise him. "What can I do for you, gentlemen?" he said. "It's warm in here. Wouldn't you like to take off your coats and hats?"
"We are only staying a minute,"
said one of them. Ashenden unwrapped his scarf and removed his heavy coat. "Won't you have a cigar?" he said, offering the box to the detectives in turn.
"I don't mind if I do,"
said Fafner, taking one, upon which Fasolt helped himself without a word. The name on the box appeared to have a marked effect on their manner, for both now took off their hats. Fafner bit half an inch off the end of his cigar and spat it in the fireplace.
"You must have had a very disagreeable walk in this bad weather."
Now, it was Ashenden's principle, a good one in life as well as in the intelligence department, always to tell as much of the truth as he conveniently could. So he said, "What do you take me for? I wouldn't go out in such weather if I could help it. I had to go to Vevey today to see an invalid friend. It was bitter on the lake."
"We come from the police,"
said Fafner. "Oh, really?
"Have you your passport on you?"
Ashenden handed the man his nice new passport, which gave no information about his movements other than that he'd come from London 3 months before and had since then crossed no frontier. The detective looked at it carefully and passed it on to his colleague.
"It appears to be all in order."
Fasolt handed back the passport to Fafner, who tapped it reflectively with a thick forefinger.
"The chief of police told us to come here," he said, "to ask you a few questions."
Ashenden knew that when you have nothing apposite to say, it's better to hold your tongue, and when a man has made a remark that calls for an answer, he's apt to find silence a trifle disconcerting. Ashenden waited for the detective to proceed.
"There have been a good many complaints lately about the noise when people come out of the casino late at night. We want to know if you personally have been troubled by the disturbance. As your rooms look onto the lake and the revelers pass your windows, if the noise is serious, you must have heard it."
For an instant, Ashenden was dumbfounded. What balderdash was this? Why on earth should the chief of police send to find out if his beauty sleep had been disturbed by noisy gamblers? It looked very like a trap. But nothing is so foolish as to ascribe profundity to what on the surface is merely inept. It flashed across his mind that the detective was asking such a question only because there was no shadow of proof that he was engaged in anything illegal. He'd clearly been denounced by someone, but no evidence had been offered, and the search of his rooms had been fruitless. But what a silly excuse this was for a visit! What a poverty of invention it showed! Ashenden immediately thought of 3 reasons the detectives might have given for seeking an interview with him, and he wished that he were on terms sufficiently familiar with them to make the suggestions. This was really an insult to the intelligence. Nevertheless, he answered the question with gravity. "To tell the truth, I'm a very sound sleeper, the result, doubtless, of a pure heart and an easy conscience, and I've never heard a thing." Ashenden looked at them for the faint smile that he thought his remark deserved, but their countenances remained stolid. Ashenden, as well as an agent of the British government, was a humorist, and he stifled the beginnings of a sigh. "But even if I had been awakened by noisy people, I shouldn't dream of complaining. At a time when there is so much trouble, misery, and unhappiness in the world, it would be very wrong to disturb the amusement of people who are lucky enough to be able to amuse themselves."
En effet,
said the detective.
but people have been disturbed, and the chief of police thought the matter should be inquired into.
His colleague, who had hitherto preserved a silence that was positively sphinx-like, now said,
"I notice by your passport that you're an author, monsieur."
"A profession full of tribulation," said Ashenden, "but now and then it has its compensations."
"And what are you doing in Geneva?"
"I'm writing a play." He waved his hand to the papers on his table. A casual glance told him that the detectives had looked and taken note of his manuscripts.
"And why should you write a play here rather than in your own country?"
Ashenden smiled upon them with even more affability than before, since this was a question for which he'd long been prepared, and it was a relief to give the answer. He was curious to see how it would go down.
"Mais, monsieur, there is the war. My country is in turmoil. The artist needs peace and quiet. How do you expect him to produce creative work unless he can have perfect tranquility? Switzerland has the good fortune to be neutral, and it seemed to me that in Geneva I should find the very surroundings I wanted."
Fafner nodded slightly to Fasolt and rose to go. When Ashenden, having warmly shaken their hands, closed the door behind the pair, he heaved a sigh of relief. He turned on the water for his bath, and as he undressed, reflected on who might have denounced him. The day before, an incident had occurred that might explain it. There was in his service a Swiss, known in the intelligence department as Bernard, who'd recently come from Germany. Ashenden, wishing to see him, had instructed him to be at a certain cafe at a certain time. Since Ashenden hadn't met him before, and so that there might be no mistake, he'd informed him through an intermediary what question he himself would ask and what reply Bernard was to give. On entering the cafe, Ashenden saw only one man of about the age he knew Bernard to be. He was by himself, and going up to him, Ashenden casually put to him the prearranged question. The prearranged answer was given, and sitting down beside him, Ashenden ordered himself a dubonnet. The spy was a stocky little fellow, shabbily dressed, with a bullet-shaped head, close-cropped, fair, with shifty blue eyes and a sallow skin. He didn't inspire confidence, but Ashenden knew by experience how hard it was to find men willing to go into Germany, which was why his predecessor must have engaged him. Bernard was a German Swiss, and spoke French with a strong accent. He immediately asked for his wages, and these Ashenden passed over in an envelope in Swiss francs. He then gave a general account of his stay in Germany and answered Ashenden's careful questions. A waiter by profession, he'd found a job in a restaurant near one of the Rhine bridges, which gave him the opportunity of getting the information that was required of him. Ashenden expressed his satisfaction, gave him his orders, and prepared to finish the interview.
"Very good," said Bernard. "But before I go back to Germany, I want 2,000 francs. Now, before you leave this cafe, it's a sum I have to pay, and I've got to have it."
"I'm afraid I can't give it to you." A scowl made the man's face even more unpleasant to look at than before.
"You've got to."
"What makes you think that?" The spy leaned forward.
"Do you think I'm going on risking my life for that beggarly sum you give me? Not 10 days ago, a man was caught at Mainz and shot. Was that one of your men?"
"We haven't got anyone at Mainz," said Ashenden. He'd been puzzled not to receive his usual communications from that place, and Bernard's information might provide the explanation. "You knew exactly what you were to get when you took on the job," said Ashenden, "and if you weren't satisfied, you needn't have taken it. I have no authority to give you a penny more." Bernard took a small revolver out of his pocket. "What are you going to do with that?" said Ashenden. "Pawn it?" Bernard shrugged angrily and put it back.
"You refuse to give me the money?"
"Certainly." The spy, although somewhat truculent, had kept his head and never for a moment raised his voice. Ashenden could see that Bernard, however big a ruffian, was a reliable agent, and he decided to suggest to R that his salary should be raised. The scene diverted him. A little way off, 2 fat citizens of Geneva with black beards were playing dominoes, and on the other side a young man with spectacles was, with great rapidity, writing sheet after sheet of an immensely long letter. Behind the counter, an imposing brunette, her large bust encased in black silk, was reading the local paper. The surroundings made the melodramatic scene in which Ashenden was engaged perfectly grotesque. His own play seemed to him much more real. Bernard smiled. His smile was not engaging.
"I have only to go to the police and tell them about you to have you arrested. Do you know what a Swiss prison is like?"
"No, I've often wondered. Do you?"
"Yes, and you wouldn't much like it."
One of the things that had bothered Ashenden was the possibility that he'd be arrested before he finished his play. He disliked the notion of leaving it half done for an indefinite period. He had a mind to ask Bernard whether he'd be allowed writing materials, but was afraid Bernard would think the inquiry an attempt to laugh at him. But he was feeling comparatively at ease, and was able to answer Bernard's threat without heat.
"You could, of course, get me sentenced to 2 years' imprisonment."
"At least." "No, that's the maximum, I understand, and I think it's quite enough. I won't conceal from you that I should find it extremely disagreeable, but not nearly so disagreeable as you would."
"What could you do?"
"Oh, we'd get you, somehow. And after all, the war won't last forever. You're a waiter. You want your freedom of action. I promise you that if I get into any trouble, you will never be admitted into any of the Allied countries for the rest of your life. I can't help thinking it would cramp your style." Bernard looked down sulkily at the marble-topped table. Ashenden thought this was the moment to pay for the drinks and go. "Think it over, Bernard," he said. "If you want to go back to your job, you have your instructions, and your usual wages will be paid through the usual channels." The spy shrugged, and Ashenden, though not knowing in the least what was the result of their conversation, felt that it behoved him to walk out with dignity. He did so. And now, as he carefully put one foot into the bath, wondering if he could bear the hot water, he asked himself what Bernard had in the end decided on. The water was just not scalding, and he gradually let himself down into it. On the whole, it seemed to him that the spy had thought it would be as well to go straight, and the source of his denunciation must be looked for elsewhere, perhaps in the hotel itself. Ashenden lay back, and as his body grew used to the water, he gave a sigh of satisfaction. Really, he reflected, there are moments in life when all the to-do that has led from the primeval slime to myself seems almost worthwhile. Ashenden could not but think himself lucky to have wriggled out of the fix he'd found himself in that afternoon. Had he been arrested and in due course sentenced, shrugging his shoulders, would merely have called him a damn fool and set about looking for someone to take his place. Already Ashenden knew his chief well enough to be aware that when he told him that if he got into trouble he need look for no help, he'd meant exactly what he said. After being visited in his hotel by 2 Swiss detectives, Ashenden felt he needed to relax. He ran a bath that was as hot as he could reasonably bear and slid gingerly into the water. Admittedly, the 2 officers had discovered nothing incriminating, but Ashenden lay wondering who could have denounced him to the authorities. He was just deciding that the bath water had grown too tepid when he heard someone knocking at his bedroom door. "Who is it?" he called. "A letter." "Come in, then. Wait a minute." Getting out of the bath, Ashenden flung a towel around him and went into the bedroom. A page boy was waiting with a note. It was from a lady staying in the hotel, asking him to play bridge after dinner, and was signed in the continental fashion, Baronne de Higgins. Ashenden, longing for a cosy meal in his room, in slippers and with a book, was about to refuse, when it occurred to him that in the circumstances it might be discreet to show himself in the dining room that night. The news would certainly have spread around the hotel that he'd been visited by the police, and it would be as well to prove to his fellow guests that he was not at all put out. It had passed through his mind that it might be someone in the hotel who'd denounced him, and indeed the name of the sprightly Baroness had suggested itself. He gave the boy a message that he'd be pleased to come, and proceeded to don his evening clothes. The Baroness von Higgins was an Austrian. On settling in Geneva during the first winter of the war, she'd found it convenient to drop the von in favour of de. Her surname she owed to her grandfather, a Yorkshire stable-boy, who'd been taken over to Austria by a Prince Blankenstein early in the 19th century. Higgins had had a romantic career. Very good-looking, he'd attracted the attention of one of the archduchesses, and then made such good use of his opportunities that he ended his life as a baron and minister plenipotentiary to an Italian court. The Baroness, his only descendant, had resumed her maiden name after an unhappy marriage. She mentioned not infrequently that her grandfather had been an ambassador, but never that he'd been a stable-boy. Ashenden had learned this interesting detail from Vienna, for as he grew friendly with her, he'd thought it necessary to get a few particulars about her. He knew, among other things, that her private income didn't permit her to live on the somewhat lavish scale she enjoyed in Geneva. Well equipped for espionage as she was, it was fairly safe to suppose that an alert German secret service had enlisted her services. If anything, it increased the cordiality of his relations with her. When he went into the dining room, the Baroness gave him a flashing smile. She was a woman of more than 40, a high-coloured blonde with golden hair of a metallic lustre, and extremely beautiful in a hard and glittering manner. Ashenden thought that the mere sight of her must arouse a sense of prudence in anyone on whom she desired to exercise her wiles. While he waited for his dinner to be served, Ashenden cast his eyes over the company. At that time Geneva was a hotbed of intrigue, and its home was the hotel at which Ashenden was staying. There were Frenchmen, Italians and Russians, Turks, Romanians, Greeks and Egyptians. There was a little German prostitute, with china blue eyes and a doll-like face, who made frequent journeys along the lake and up to Bern, and in the exercise of her profession got little tidbits of information, over which doubtless they deliberated in Berlin. Ashenden was surprised to catch sight of Count von Holzminden, the German agent in Vevey, who came over to Geneva only on occasion. Ashenden had known the Count fairly well in London before the war, a tall, thin fellow in well-cut clothes with a close-cropped Prussian head. He was fond of England. He danced well, rode well, and shot well. People said he was more English than the English. He had charming manners, and was much interested in the fine arts. Now Ashenden and he pretended they'd never seen one another before, for each, of course, knew the work on which the other was engaged. Ashenden was perplexed. Holzminden had never set foot in that hotel before, and it was unlikely that he'd done so now without good reason. Ashenden asked himself whether it had anything to do with the unusual presence in the dining-room of Prince Ali. Prince Ali was an Egyptian, a near relation of the Khedive. When the Khedive was deposed, Prince Ali had fled his country. A bitter enemy of the English, he was known to be stirring up trouble in Egypt. The week before, the Khedive, in great secrecy, had spent 3 days at the hotel, and the pair of them had held constant meetings in the prince's apartments. Prince Ali was a little fat man with a heavy black moustache. He was living with his 2 daughters and a certain Pasha, Mustafa by name, who was his secretary and managed his affairs. The 4 of them were now dining together in a stolid silence. The 2 princesses were emancipated young women who spent their nights dancing in restaurants with the bloods of Geneva. Short and stout, with fine black eyes and heavy, sallow faces, they were dressed with a rich loudness that suggested the fish market at Cairo rather than the Rue de la Paix. His Highness usually ate upstairs, but the princesses dined every evening in the public dining-room. They were chaperoned vaguely by a little old Englishwoman, a Miss King, who'd been their governess. But she sat at a table by herself, and they appeared to pay no attention to her. On his arrival, Ashenden had tried to scrape acquaintance with Miss King, but she'd received his advances with frigidity. She was a tiny woman, just a few little bones in a bag of wrinkled skin. It was obvious that she wore a wig, mousy brown and not always set quite straight, and she was heavily made up, with great patches of scarlet on her withered cheeks and brilliantly red lips. She dressed fantastically, in garments that looked as though they'd been bought higgledy-piggledy from an old clothes shop. She wore extravagantly girlish hats, and tripped along in very small, smart shoes with very high heels. Her appearance was so gruesome that people turned in the street and stared at her. Ashenden was told that Miss King hadn't been to England since she was first engaged as governess to the prince's mother. Ashenden wondered where she came from. An exile from her country for so long, she must possess in it neither family nor friends. He knew her sentiments were anti-English, and she never spoke anything but French, though in a strong English accent. She appeared actively to dislike him. When her gaze met his, he imagined that she'd tried to put into her stare an unspoken insult. In that painted, withered visage, it was for some reason rather oddly pathetic. But now the Baroness de Higgins, having finished her dinner, gathered up her handkerchief and her bag, and with waiters bowing on either side, sailed down the spacious room. She stopped at Ashenden's table. She looked magnificent. "I'm so glad you can play bridge tonight. Will you come to my sitting room when you are ready and have your coffee?" "What a lovely dress," said Ashenden. "It is frightful. I have nothing to wear. I don't know what I shall do now that I cannot go to Paris." She raised her voice. "Those horrible Prussians. Why did they want to drag my poor country into this terrible war?" She gave a flashing smile and sailed on. Ashenden was among the last to finish, and when he left the dining room, it was almost empty. As he walked past Count Holzminden, he hazarded the shadow of a wink. The German agent couldn't be quite sure of it, and if he suspected it, might rack his brains to discover what mystery it portended. Ashenden walked up to the second floor and knocked at the Baroness's door. She flung it open, shook both his hands with cordiality, and drew him into the room. He saw that the two persons who were to make the four had already arrived. They were Prince Ali and his secretary. Ashenden was astounded. "Allow me to introduce Mr. Ashenden to your Highness," said the Baroness. Ashenden bowed and took the proffered hand. Madame de Higgins went on. "Have you met the Pasha?" The Prince's secretary shook his hand warmly. "I am delighted to make your acquaintance, Mr. Ashenden." Mustafa Pasha was a huge, fat fellow of 45, perhaps, with large, mobile eyes and a big black moustache. He wore a dinner jacket with a large diamond in his shirt front and the fez, or tarbouche, of his country. Having provided her guests with coffee and liqueurs, the Baroness produced the cards. Ashenden couldn't help wondering why he'd been asked to play. The game was obviously a pretext, and Ashenden had no notion what other game was being played. He'd felt for a day or two that something was in the air, and this meeting confirmed his suspicions. But he hadn't the faintest notion what this something was. He was now persuaded that he owed that visit of the Swiss police to the kindly intervention of the Baroness, and it looked as though the bridge party had been arranged when it was discovered that the detectives had been able to do nothing. The notion was mysterious, but diverting, and as Ashenden played, he watched what was said by himself no less closely than what was said by the others. At one moment he had a suspicion that he was being sounded upon the possibility of selling himself. It was done so discreetly that he couldn't be quite sure, but a suggestion seemed floating in the air that a clever writer could do his country a good turn and make a vast amount of money for himself if he cared to enter into an arrangement that would bring to a troubled world the peace that every humane man must so sincerely desire. It was plain that nothing very much would be said that first evening, but Ashenden, as evasively as he could, more by general amiability than by words, tried to indicate that he was willing to hear more of the subject. But while he talked with the Pasha and the beautiful Austrian, he was conscious that the watchful eyes of Prince Ali were upon him, and he had an uneasy suspicion that they read too much of his thoughts. Soon after midnight, a rubber ended, and the Prince rose. "It's getting late, and Mr. Ashenden has doubtless much to do tomorrow. We must not keep him up." Ashenden looked on this as a signal to take himself off. When he got to his room, he suddenly realized that he was dog-tired, and the moment he flung himself into bed, he fell asleep. He'd have sworn that he hadn't been asleep 5 minutes when he was dragged back to wakefulness by a knocking at the door. "Who is it?" "It's the maid. Open up, I have something to say to you." Cursing, Ashenden unlocked and opened the door. Outside stood a tousled Swiss maid, looking as though she'd thrown on her clothes in a hurry. "The old English lady, the governess of the Egyptian princesses, is dying, and she wants to see you." "Me?" said Ashenden. "I don't know her. She asks for you. The doctor says, will you come? She cannot last much longer." "It must be a mistake. She can't want me." "She said your name and the number of your room. She says, quick, quick." Ashenden shrugged. He went back into his room to put on slippers and a dressing-gown, and as an afterthought dropped a small revolver into his pocket. It was ridiculous to suppose that those two cordial, stout Egyptian gentlemen were laying some kind of trap for him, but in the work upon which Ashenden was engaged, the dullness of routine was apt now and again to slip quite shamelessly into melodrama. Miss King's room was 2 floors higher than Ashenden's, and as he accompanied the chambermaid along the corridor and up the stairs, he asked her what was the matter with the old governess.
"I think she has had a stroke. I don't know. The night porter woke me and said Monsieur Bridet wanted me to get up at once."
Monsieur Bridet was the assistant manager. When the maid knocked at Miss King's door, it was Monsieur Bridet who opened it. He'd evidently been roused from his sleep. He wore slippers on his bare feet, grey trousers, and a frock coat over his pyjamas. He looked absurd.
"A thousand excuses for disturbing you, Monsieur Ashenden, but she kept asking for you, and the doctor said you should be sent for."
"It doesn't matter at all." Ashenden walked in. It was a small back room, and all the lights were on. The windows were closed, and the curtains drawn. It was intensely hot. The doctor, a bearded, grizzled Swiss, was standing at the bedside. Monsieur Bridet, notwithstanding his evident harassment, remained the attentive manager and effected the proper introduction.
"This is Mr. Ashenden, for whom Miss King has been asking, Dr. Arbo of the Faculty of Medicine of Geneva."
Without a word, the doctor pointed to the bed. On it lay Miss King. It gave Ashenden a shock to look at her. She wore a large white cotton nightcap. He noticed the brown wig on a stand on the dressing-table, and a white, voluminous nightdress that came high up in the neck. Her face was still greasy with the cream she'd used before going to bed to remove her makeup, but she had removed it summarily, and there were streaks of black on her eyebrows and of red on her cheeks. She looked very small, lying in the bed, no larger than a child, and immensely old. She must be well over 80, thought Ashenden. She lay perfectly still on her back, the tiny body hardly marked under the blanket, her face even smaller than usual because she'd removed her teeth. You'd have thought she was dead but for the black eyes, strangely large in the shrunken mask that stared unblinkingly. Ashenden thought their expression changed when she saw him. "Well, I'm sorry to see you like this," he said.
"She cannot speak," said the doctor. "She had another little stroke when the maid went to fetch you. I have just given her an injection. She may partly recover the use of her tongue in a little while. She has something to say to you."
"I'll gladly wait," said Ashenden. He fancied that in those dark eyes he saw a look of relief. For a moment or two the 4 of them stood round the bed and stared at the dying woman.
"Well," said Monsieur Bridet, "if there's nothing I can do, I may just as well go back to bed." "Allez, mon ami," said the doctor. "You can do nothing."
Monsieur Bridet turned to Ashenden.
"May I have a word with you?"
"Certainly." The doctor noticed a sudden fear in Miss King's eyes.
"Do not be alarmed. Monsieur Ashenden is not going. He will stay as long as you wish."
The assistant manager took Ashenden to the door and partly closed it so that those within should not hear.
"Monsieur Ashenden, it is a very disagreeable thing to have anyone die in a hotel. The other guests do not like it, and we must do all we can to prevent their knowing. I shall have the body removed the first possible moment, and I shall be extremely obliged if you will not say that there has been a death."
"You can have every confidence in me," said Ashenden.
"Of course, if it had been possible, I would have sent for an ambulance and had her taken to the hospital, but the doctor said she might die before we got her downstairs, and absolutely refused to let me. It is not my fault if she dies in the hotel."
Death so often chooses its moments without consideration, murmured Ashenden.
After all, said Monsieur Bridet, she is an old woman. She should have died years ago. Why did this Egyptian prince want to have a governess of that age? He ought to have sent her back to her own country.
Where is the prince now? Asked Ashenden. She has been in his service for many years. Ought you not to wake him?
He is not in the hotel. He went out with his secretary. He may be playing baccarat. I do not know. Anyhow, I cannot send all over Geneva to find him.
And the princesses?
Oh, they have not come in. They seldom return to the hotel till dawn. I do not know where they are. In any case, they would not thank me for dragging them away from their diversions because their governess has had a stroke. I know what they are. The night porter will tell them when they arrive, and then they can please themselves. She does not want them. When the night porter fetched me and I went into her room, I asked where His Highness was, and she cried, "No, no."
She could talk, then?
After a fashion. But the thing that surprised me was that she spoke in English. She always insisted on talking French. You know she hated the English.
What did she want with me?
That I cannot tell you. She says she had something that she must say to you at once. It is funny, she knew the number of your room. At first, when she asked for you, I would not let them send. I cannot have my clients disturbed in the middle of the night because a crazy old woman asked for them. But when the doctor came, he insisted. She gave us no peace, and when I said she must wait till morning, she cried.
Ashenden looked at the assistant manager. He seemed to find nothing at all touching in the scene he related.
Well, I shall try to get a little sleep. I shall give the night porter orders to wake me when everything is over. If everything goes well, we may be able to get the body away before it is light.
Ashenden went back into the room, and immediately the dark eyes of the dying woman fixed upon him.
"You do not mind waiting?"
asked the doctor. "Of course not. But tell me what happened. How was Miss King discovered?" The doctor described the events of the evening as they'd been told to him. It appeared that the night porter had been roused by the ringing of the telephone from Miss King's room, but could get no one to speak. He'd put down the receiver, but the bell had continued to ring, so he went upstairs and knocked at the door. Receiving no reply, he'd entered with his passkey, and found Miss King lying on the floor.
"And now," said the doctor, "there is really nothing more that I can do."
He patted her raddled cheek, as though she were a child.
"You must try to sleep. I will come back in the morning."
He shuffled himself into a heavy coat and picked up his bag. Ashenden accompanied him to the door. Coming back, he looked at the maid. She sat on the edge of a chair, uneasily, her broad, ugly face bloated with fatigue. "There's no use in your staying up," said Ashenden. "Why don't you go to bed?"
"Monsieur wouldn't like to remain here alone. Somebody must stay with him."
"But good heavens, why? You have your day's work to do tomorrow." She rose heavily to her feet.
"As the gentleman wishes. But I will stay very willingly."
Ashenden smiled and shook his head. She went out, and Ashenden was left alone. He sat by the bedside, and again his eyes met Miss King's. It was embarrassing to encounter that unshrinking stare. "Don't worry yourself, Miss King. You've had a slight stroke. I'm sure your speech will come back to you in a minute." He felt certain then that he saw in those dark eyes a desperate effort to speak. He could not be mistaken. The mind was shaken by desire, but the paralyzed body was incapable of obedience. Her disappointment expressed itself quite plainly. Tears came to her eyes and ran down her cheeks. Ashenden took out his handkerchief and dried them. "Don't distress yourself, Miss King. Have a little patience, and I'm sure you'll be able to say anything you want." He didn't know if he read in her eyes now the despairing thought that she had no time to wait. Perhaps it was only that he ascribed to her the notions that came to himself. "Wouldn't you be more comfortable if I turned out some of the lights?" said Ashenden. He put out all the lamps but the one by the bedside, and then sat down again. Once more his eyes were held by those other eyes which contained all that remained alive of that old, old woman. He felt certain that she had something that she wanted urgently to say to him. But what was it? Perhaps she'd asked him only because, feeling death near, she'd had a sudden yearning to die with someone of her own people, so long forgotten, by her side. But why send for him? There were other English people in the hotel. "Have you got something to say to me, Miss King?" He had tried to read an answer in her eyes. They continued to stare at him meaningfully, but what the meaning was, he had no notion. Those black eyes seemed to glow mysteriously, as though there were fires behind them, holding him with that insistent stare. Then Ashenden asked himself if she'd sent for him because she knew that he was a British agent. Was it possible that, at the moment of death, a love for her country that had been dead for half a century awakened again in her, and she'd been seized with a desire to do something for what was, after all, her own? Ashenden, his common sense protesting, became strangely convinced that she had some secret that she wished to impart to him. She'd sent for him, knowing who he was, because he could make use of it. Ashenden leaned forward, trying more eagerly to read what her eyes had to say. How much that old woman must know. Once again Ashenden remembered how he'd had the impression that something of real consequence was being prepared round about him. It was curious that Holzminden should have come to the hotel that day, and why had Prince Ali and the Pasha, those wild gamblers, wasted an evening in playing contract bridge with him? It might be that the very greatest affairs were afoot, and perhaps what the old woman had to say might make all the difference, might mean defeat or victory. And there she lay, powerless to speak. For a long time, Ashenden stared at her in silence. Suddenly he said, "Has it got anything to do with the war, Miss King?" Something passed through her eyes, and a tremor shot across her little old face. Something strange and horrible was happening, and Ashenden held his breath. The tiny, frail body was suddenly convulsed, and the old woman, as though by a final, desperate effort of will, raised herself up in the bed. Ashenden sprang forward to support her. "England," she said. Just that one word, and fell back in his arms. When he laid her down on the pillow, he saw that she was dead. Ashenden's official existence in Switzerland was as monotonous as a city clerk's, until one day the hotel porter handed him a telegram. "Aunt Maggie not at all well. Staying at Hotel Loti, Paris. If possible, please go and see her. Raymond." Raymond was one of R's facetious noms de guerre, and since Ashenden was not so fortunate as to possess an Aunt Maggie, he concluded that this was an order to go to Paris. When Ashenden reached the Hotel Loti, An orderly took him up to R's apartment. R was standing with his back to a bright log fire. He looked older than when Ashenden had last seen him.
"I've got a job for you," he said.
Ashenden made no reply, but he felt a happy little flutter somewhere about the pit of his stomach.
"Have you ever heard of Chandra Lal?"
"No, sir." R went over to a dispatch case and took out a photograph.
"That's him."
It showed a fat-faced, swarthy man with full lips and a fleshy nose. His hair was black, thick and straight. He looked ill at ease in European clothes.
"Here he is in native dress,"
said R, giving Ashenden another photograph. This was full length, and had evidently been taken some years earlier. He was thinner, and his great, serious eyes seemed to devour his face. In his turban and long, pale tunic, he was not without dignity.
"Here's his dossier," said R. "Read it, will you?"
R gave Ashenden a couple of typewritten pages, and Ashenden sat down and skimmed the report. It appeared that Chandra Lal was a dangerous agitator. A lawyer by profession, he was bitterly hostile to British rule in India. At the beginning of the war, he began to foment active rebellion, with the aim of preventing the British from transferring troops to the seat of war. Helped by immense sums given to him by German agents, he was able to cause a great deal of trouble, including 3 bomb outrages which had killed innocent bystanders. At last, a high reward was offered for his arrest, but he fled the country and eventually reached Berlin. Here he busied himself with schemes to create disaffection among the Indian troops that had been brought to Europe. The report ended, "C has a wife in India and 2 children. He is not known to have anything to do with women. He neither drinks nor smokes. He has undoubted courage, and is said to pride himself on keeping his word." Ashenden returned the document to R.
"He looks a dangerous fellow." "He's the most dangerous conspirator in or out of India," said R. "I've been trying to catch him for a year. I thought there wasn't a hope, but now, at last, I've got a chance."
He looked across at Ashenden.
"At the end of that report, it said he wasn't known to have anything to do with women. Well, that's no longer true. The damned fool has fallen in love."
R stepped over to his dispatch case and took out a bundle tied up with pale blue ribbon.
"Here are his love letters. Take them away with you."
He flung the neat little bundle back.
"Chandra has fallen madly in love with a woman called Giulia Lazzari. She's Italian, but for stage purposes she calls herself La Malagueña. She specializes in Spanish dances."
"Is she any good?"
"No, rotten. Chandra met her in Berlin in a cheap music hall."
He took up the Indian's photograph again and looked at it thoughtfully.
"You wouldn't have thought there was anything very attractive in him, would you? But she fell very nearly as much in love with him as he did with her. I've got her letters, too, only copies, of course. She's mad about him."
"But how did you get hold of all these letters?"
"How do you imagine? Being Italian, Giulia Lazzari was eventually expelled from Germany. She was put over the Dutch frontier."
R looked up a date among the papers.
"On the 24th of October she sailed from Rotterdam to Harwich. Since then she's danced in London and other places. She was arrested a fortnight ago at Hull."
"What for?"
"Espionage. She was transferred to London, and I went to see her myself at Holloway."
Ashenden looked at him. "How did you get on to her?"
"I thought it odd that the Germans should allow her to dance in Berlin for weeks and then for no particular reason put her out of the country, so I kept track of her. I discovered that she was sending letters to an address in Holland 2 or 3 times a week, and receiving answers in rather flowery English. I had no idea it was Chandra Lal till I found the photograph."
"How did you get that?"
"She carried it about with her with a lot of theatrical photographs. Might easily have passed for some music hall artiste in stage dress. But I put a smart lad on the job, and he thought it odd that it was the only photograph that came from Calcutta. There was a number on the back, and we cabled to Calcutta. I soon learned that the object of Julia's affections was no less than the incorruptible Chandra Lal. We had Julia watched more carefully. I'd soon got a pretty body of evidence against her. How was she getting her stuff through? She wasn't trying to. The Germans had expelled her quite genuinely. She wasn't working for them, she was working for Chandra. After her tour in England, she was planning to go back to Holland and meet him. R rubbed his hands together. As soon as I got the goods on her, I arrested her. I had enough evidence to convict a regiment of spies. His pale lips twisted to a smile. Holloway is not a very cheerful place, you know. I left her to stew in her own juice for a week. Then I went to see her. I told her she'd get 10 years. She went all to pieces, and at last she confessed everything. Then I told her I'd let her go scot-free if she'd get Chandra to come to France. She absolutely refused, said she'd rather die. I told her to think it over. When I came back a week later, she asked me quite calmly what it was exactly that I proposed. She'd been in jail a fortnight then, and I expect she'd had about enough of it. I told her that if she can get Chandra to cross the Swiss frontier and come into France, she's to go free to Spain, with her passage paid. And how the devil is she to get Chandra to do that? He's madly in love with her. He's longing to see her. She's written to him to say that she can't get a visa to Holland, but she can get one for Switzerland, a neutral country, where he's safe. He jumped at the chance. They've arranged to meet at Lausanne. When he reaches Lausanne, he'll get a letter from her to say that the French authorities won't let her cross the frontier, but that she's in Tonon, which is just on the other side of the lake in France, and she's going to ask him to come there. Julia Lazzari is arriving from England this evening in custody. I'd like you to take her down to Tonon by the night train. And what do you expect me to do when I get the lady to Tonon? I leave you a free hand. I've made a few notes that may be useful to you. I'll read them to you, shall I? Ashenden listened attentively. R's plan was simple and explicit. Ashenden could not but feel unwilling admiration for the brain that had so neatly devised it. The train started at 8. When he'd disposed of his bag, Ashenden found the carriage in which Julia Lazzari sat. She was in the charge of 2 detectives, who'd taken her over from English police at Boulogne. At Ashenden's suggestion, the detectives left them alone. She gave him a sullen look. Julia Lazzari was far from young. She might have been 35, and her skin was lined and sallow. She had no makeup on, and she looked haggard. "Who are you?" she said. "My name would mean nothing to you, madame. I have taken a room for you at the Hôtel de la Place at Tonon. I think you will find it quite comfortable." "So you are my jailer?" "I hope for not very long. I have in my pocket your passport with all the formalities completed to permit you to go to Spain." Her face was suddenly a mask of despair. "It's infamous. I wrote the letter the colonel said I was to write. Why isn't that enough? What is to happen to me if he does not answer? I cannot force him to come." "He has answered," said Ashenden. "I have the answer with me." "Oh, show it to me. I beg you to let me see it." He took Chandra's letter from his pocket and gave it to her. She snatched it and devoured it with her eyes. There were 8 pages of it, and as she read, the tears streamed down her cheeks. "You can see he loves me, can't you? There's no doubt about that. Oh, it is an infamous thing that you are forcing me to do, shameful." Ashenden replaced the letter in his pocketbook. "You're not obliged to do it, but I'm afraid you must take the consequences." "I cannot go to prison," she cried. "I've such a short time before me. What should I be in 10 years? Oh, no, no."
Ashenden reached for his hat. "Well, I'll leave you now. I hope you sleep. I'll fetch you in the morning." Next morning it was sunny, though cold, when they reached their destination. Ashenden, having given his bags to a porter, walked along the platform to where Giulia Lazzari and the two detectives were standing. Ashenden nodded to them. "You needn't trouble to wait." They touched their hats and walked away. "Am I in your custody now?" she said. "You're in nobody's custody. I'll take you to your hotel, and then I'll leave you." They took a cab to the hotel. On arrival, the proprietor showed them the room that had been prepared for Madame Lazzari. "This will do very nicely," said Ashenden. The proprietor bowed and withdrew. "You are now a guest of the hotel like any other," said Ashenden. "You may order anything you like. You are absolutely free." "Free to go out?" she asked quickly. "Of course, you may come and go as you choose. All I'd like is an assurance from you that you will not write letters without my knowledge, or attempt to leave Tonon without my permission." She gave Ashenden a long stare. She couldn't make it out at all. "My situation compels me to give you any assurance you ask." "Thank you. Now I'll leave you. I'll come to see you tomorrow morning." Ashenden took a cab to a secluded house on the outskirts of the town, at which, on his periodical visits to this place, he stayed. It was pleasant to have a bath and a shave, and get into slippers. He spent the rest of the morning reading a novel. Soon after dark, an agent from the police station came to see him, a little dark Frenchman called Felix. Ashenden offered him a glass of wine, and they sat down by the fire. "Well, your lady lost no time," he said. "Within a quarter of an hour she was out of the hotel with a bundle of clothes and trinkets that she sold in a shop near the market. When the afternoon boat came in, she went down to the quay and bought a ticket to Evian." Evian was the next place along the lake in France, and from there the boat crossed over to Switzerland. Of course she hadn't a passport, so she was refused permission to embark. Next day, when Ashenden went to see her, he made no reference to her attempt to escape. "What do you want of me now?" she said. "I do not suppose you have come to ask after my health." Ashenden smiled. "I want you to write a letter to your lover, telling him that owing to some irregularity in your passport, the Swiss authorities would not let you cross the frontier, so you have come here to Tonon, where it is very nice and quiet, and you propose that Chandra should join you." "Do you think he is a fool? He will refuse." "Then you must do your best to persuade him." She looked at Ashenden a long time. He suspected she was deciding that appearing docile would gain her time. "Well, dictate, and I will write what you say." "I should prefer you to put it in your own words." She sat down at the dressing-table and began to write. When she handed Ashenden the letter, he saw that it was good enough, and when, towards the end, she started to say how much she loved the man, she'd written with all her heart. "Now," said Ashenden, "add, the man who is bringing this is Swiss. You can trust him absolutely. I didn't want the censor to see it." She wrote as he directed. "Now address an envelope, and I will relieve you of my unwelcome presence." He gave the letter to the agent, who was waiting to take it across the lake, and the same evening Ashenden brought her the reply. When she read it, she uttered a cry of relief. "He won't come." The letter, in the Indian's flowery, stilted English, expressed his bitter disappointment. He told her how intensely he'd looked forward to seeing her, and implored her to do everything possible to smooth the difficulties that prevented her from crossing the frontier. He said that it was impossible for him to come. Impossible. There was a price on his head, and it would be madness. "You must write," said Ashenden, "and tell him that there's no risk. You must say that if he loves you, he will not hesitate." "I won't! I won't!" She burst into a flood of tears. She flung herself on the floor, and seizing Ashenden's knees, implored him to have mercy on her. "I will do anything in the world for you, if you will let me go." "Don't be absurd," said Ashenden. "You think I want to become your lover? Come on, you know the alternative. Will you write, or shall I send for the police?" Without a word, she reached for pen and paper. The answer to the letter wasn't delivered to him till after dinner the following day, when it was brought to Ashenden's little house by Felix. "Well, what news have you?" "Our friend is getting desperate," smiled the Frenchman. "This afternoon she offered a boatman 1,000 francs to take her across to Lausanne. He said he couldn't risk it, so she's asked him to meet her at 10 o'clock tonight so that they can talk of it again." "Are you sure you can trust him?" asked Ashenden. "Oh, you need have no fear about him. He's a good boy. I've known him all his life." Ashenden read Chandra's letter. It was eager and passionate, but he repeated again and again that he couldn't come, and begged her not to ask him. Felix said, "I've arranged to meet the boatman at the landing stage between 11 and 12. Ashenden looked at his watch. "I'll come with you." They walked down the hill, and reaching the quay, saw a man approaching. "Monsieur Felix," he said, "I have a letter for you. I promise to take it to Lausanne by the first boat tomorrow." Ashenden took the letter and read it by the light of Felix's torch. "On no account come. Pay no attention to my letters. Danger. I love you. Sweetheart. Don't come." He put it in his pocket, gave the boatman 50 francs, and went home to bed. The next day, when he went to see Giulia Lazzari, he found her in a dressing gown, her hair dishevelled. "I'm at the end of my strength. I can do nothing more. You have only to look at me to see that I am ill." He took out of his pocket the letter she'd given the boatman, and handed it to her. "What's the meaning of this?" She gave a gasp, and her sallow face went green. "You gave me your word that you would neither attempt to escape nor write a letter without my knowledge." "Did you think I'd keep my word?" she cried. "No, but it's silly to waste your time writing letters that will never be delivered. What you must do is sit down and write a letter that will be." "Never. I will do nothing more. I will not write another word." "Madame," said Ashenden, "in 5 minutes' time I will telephone to the police station for the 2 detectives who accompanied you from England. You will be handcuffed and escorted back to face your trial for espionage and your certain sentence. The decision is yours." She looked around her wildly, like a trapped animal. There was no escape. "What do you want me to do?" "I want you to write another letter to Chandra." "My head is in a whirl. I could not put 2 phrases together. You must give me time." "I will dictate the letter for you. All you have to do is to write exactly what I tell you." She took the pen and the paper and sat down at the dressing table. "Tell me what you want me to write." 10 minutes later, when Ashenden read over the letter, he wasn't altogether satisfied. But it had an air of verisimilitude because the spelling was atrocious, and she'd crossed out words and written them over again. Once or twice tears had fallen on the pages and blurred the ink. "If you loved me," she'd written, "you couldn't hesitate when I ask you to come, and I promise you there is no danger. If you don't love me, you are right not to come. Go back to Berlin, where you are in safety. I have made myself ill by waiting for you. Every day I have said he is coming. But you do not love me. I am sick and tired of waiting. I have no money. There is nothing for me to stay for. I can get an engagement in Paris. I have a friend there who has made me a serious proposition. I have waited long enough over you. It is finished. Goodbye. You will never find a woman who will love you as I have loved you. I have telegraphed my friend, and as soon as I receive his answer, I go to Paris. I do not blame you for not loving me. That is not your fault, but you must see that I should be stupid to go on wasting my life. One is not young forever. Goodbye, Julia." That afternoon Ashenden sent the messenger to Lausanne with the letter, and next morning went down to the quay to meet the boat. There was a waiting room next to the ticket office, and here he told the detectives to hold themselves in readiness. When a boat arrived, the passengers advanced along the pier in line, and their passports were examined before they were allowed to go ashore. Ashenden scanned the line of people closely, but saw no one who looked in the least like an Indian. Chandra hadn't come. When the passengers had gone their way, Ashenden strolled along the pier. "Well, it's no go," he said to Felix, who'd been examining the passports. "I have a letter for you," said Felix. He handed Ashenden an envelope addressed to Madame Lazzari in Chandra Lal's spidery handwriting. At that moment the steamer from Geneva hove in sight. It arrived every morning 20 minutes after the steamer going in the opposite direction had left, and went on to Lausanne. Ashenden had an inspiration. "Where's the man who brought it?" "In the ticket office. Tell him to return it to the person who gave it to him. He's to say that he took it to the lady and she sent it back. If the person asks him to take another letter, he's to say that it's not much good as she's packing her trunk and leaving Tonon." The next boat on which Chandra could possibly come arrived about 5. Since Ashenden had an important engagement at that time with an agent working in Germany, he warned Felix that he might be a few minutes late. But if Chandra came, he could easily be detained. When Ashenden had finished his business, he strolled down to the lake. Suddenly he saw someone running towards him, and recognized the man who'd taken the letter. "Quick, quick!" he cried. "He's there!" Ashenden's heart gave a great thud against his chest. At last! He began to run too, and was out of breath when they reached the pier. He burst into the waiting room. A group of men were clustered round a man lying on the ground. "What's happened?" he cried. "Look," said Felix. Chandra Lal lay there, dead, a thin line of foam on his lips, his body horribly contorted. "He's killed himself. He was too quick for us. We've sent for a doctor." When the Indian landed, Felix recognized him from the description. There were only 4 passengers. He was the last. Felix examined the passports of the other 3, then he looked at Chandra's. "Just come into the waiting room for a moment. There are 1 or 2 formalities." As Chandra followed him into the waiting room, the 2 detectives stood up. Chandra must have realized at once that he'd fallen into a trap. "It's hot in here," he said. "May I take off my coat?" "Certainly," said Felix. As he struggled out of his coat, they were startled to see him stagger and fall to the ground. Chandra had managed to swallow the contents of a bottle that was still clasped in his hand. They stood for a while looking at the man who lay on the floor. Soon a doctor arrived and pronounced life extinct. "Prussic acid," he said to Ashenden. Ashenden nodded. "I will go and see Madame Lazzari." Ashenden found her sitting in front of her dressing table, looking at herself in the glass, idly, despairingly. Her face changed suddenly as she caught sight of him, and she sprang up. "What is it? Why are you so white? Il est pris?" "Il est mort," said Ashenden. "Dead? So he took the poison. He's escaped you after all." "What do you mean? How did you know about the poison?" "He always carried it with him. He said that the English should never take him alive." Ashenden reflected for an instant. She kept that secret well. He supposed the possibility should have occurred to him. "Well, now you are free. Here's your ticket and your passport. A telegram will be sent tonight to the Spanish frontier to instruct the authorities to put no difficulties in your way." She said nothing, and Ashenden made ready to go. "I'm sorry that I've had to show myself so hard to you.
I hope that time will assuage the grief that I know you must feel for the death of your friend."
Ashenden turned to the door, but she stopped him. "One moment. There is something I should like to ask."
"I'll do whatever I can."
"What are you going to do with these things?"
"I don't know. Why?"
Then she said something that confounded Ashenden. The last thing he ever expected. "He had a wristwatch that I gave him last Christmas. It cost £12. Can I have it back?"
This video was uploaded to the channel Thinking Out Louder. Please like, comment and subscribe to the Thinking Out Louder channel. Thank you.
Grantley Capor was an Englishman, born, according to his passport, in Birmingham. He was 42 years of age. His wife, to whom he'd been married for 11 years, was of German birth and parentage. That was public knowledge. Information about his antecedents was contained in a private document. According to this, he'd started his career in a lawyer's office in Birmingham and had then drifted into journalism. He'd been connected with an English paper in Cairo and with another in Shanghai. There he got into trouble for attempting to get money on false pretenses and was sentenced to a short term of imprisonment. After his release, all trace of him was lost for 2 years, when he reappeared in a shipping office in Marseille. From there, still in the shipping business, he went to Hamburg, where he married, and to London. In 1914, at the outbreak of war, Capor was living quietly with his German wife at Southampton. In the beginning of 1915, he told his employers that his wife's nationality was making his position intolerable, and they granted his request to be transferred to Genoa. Here he remained till Italy entered the war, but then gave notice, crossed the border, and took up residence in Switzerland. These facts were of no importance to anyone, until it was discovered that Capor, certainly from the beginning of the war and perhaps earlier, was in the service of the German intelligence department. From then on, his letters, and he received a good many, were closely censored. There were few codes that the people who dealt in such matters couldn't, in the end, decipher. Even so, no steps were taken against him. He could do no great harm, and it might even be possible to use him to convey information that it was desirable to let the enemy have. Then Capor did something that drew R's attention to him. He scraped acquaintance in Zurich with a young Spaniard, Gomez by name, who'd lately entered the British Secret Service, and managed to worm out of him the fact that he was engaged in espionage. On Capor's information, the Spaniard was watched when he went to Germany, and one day caught as he was posting a letter in a code that was eventually deciphered. He was tried, convicted, and shot. R wasn't pleased, but it occurred to him that if Capor was merely betraying his country for money, it might be possible to get him to take more money to betray his employers. But R had no notion what kind of man Capor was, so he instructed Ashenden to get acquainted with him and see whether there was any chance that he would work honestly for the British. If Ashenden thought there was, he was authorized to sound him out and make certain propositions. If, on the other hand, Ashenden came to the conclusion that Capor couldn't be bought, he was to report his movements.
It was known that the head of the German intelligence department in Bern, a Major von Posen, was growing restive at Capor's lack of activity. In his coded letters, Capor had been asking for a higher salary, and Major von Posen had told him that he must earn it. And so, a week later, Ashenden found himself in Lucerne, signing into a small, spotlessly clean German hotel of the second class. The landlady was curious to know why, in that dead season, he'd come to stay. He told her that he'd recently recovered from an attack of typhoid and had come to Lucerne to get back his strength. He was employed in the censorship department and was taking the opportunity to brush up his rusty German. He asked her if she could recommend a German teacher. The landlady, a blousy Swiss, good-humoured and talkative, would, Ashenden felt pretty sure, repeat the information in the proper quarter. It was his turn now to ask a few questions. She was voluble on the subject of the war, on account of which the hotel was nearly empty. She had only 2 lots of resident guests. One was an old Irish couple who lived in Vevey and passed their summers in Lucerne, and the other was an Englishman and his wife. She was a German, and they were obliged on that account to live in a neutral country. Dinner was at 7, and Ashenden went down as soon as he heard the bell. It was a plain, whitewashed room, very neat and clean. Presently 1 or 2 persons came in, single men with some occupation in Lucerne. They propped newspapers against their water jugs, and read while they somewhat noisily ate their soup. Then a tall, bent man with white hair and a drooping white moustache came in, accompanied by a little old white-haired lady in black. These were certainly the Irish colonel and his wife of whom the landlady had spoken. At last came the persons for whom Ashenden had been waiting. He was doing his best to read a German book, and allowed himself to raise his eyes for an instant. His glance showed him a man of about 45, with short dark hair and a broad, red, clean-shaven face. He walked ahead of his wife, and of her Ashenden caught only a glimpse. Grantley Capor sat down and began explaining to the waitress that they'd taken an immense walk up some mountain. "Serve me quick, we're starving. And bring beer, 3 bottles. Lieber Gott, what a thirst I have." He seemed a man of exuberant vitality. He began to talk to his wife in English, but presently she interrupted him in an undertone. Capor stopped, and Ashenden felt his gaze fixed intently upon him. When Ashenden had finished his dinner and went out into the hall, he saw a bull terrier tied to a table leg. In passing, he fondled the dog's drooping soft ears. The landlady was standing at the foot of the stairs. "That's Fritzi. He belongs to Herr Capor." Ashenden decided to take no steps to make Capor's acquaintance. If Capor was being pressed for results, it must surely occur to him that an Englishman employed in the censorship department would be worth knowing. He didn't have to wait long. Next day he was sitting in the doorway of the hotel drinking a cup of coffee after lunch when the Capors came out of the dining room. Mrs. Capor went upstairs, and Capor released his dog, which bounded along and leapt up against Ashenden in friendly fashion. "Come here, Fritzi," cried Capor, and then to Ashenden, "I'm so sorry, but he's quite gentle." "Oh, that's all right. He won't hurt me." Capor called to the maid, "A coffee, please, Fräulein." He turned to Ashenden. "You've just arrived, haven't you?" "Yes, I came yesterday." "Are you staying?" "For a while. I've been ill, and I've come here to recuperate." Hesitatingly, Ashenden explained the facts that he told the landlady the day before, and that he was convinced she'd already passed on to Capor. "You couldn't have come to a better place than Lucerne. It's an oasis of peace in this war-weary world. That's why I've come here. You see, I married a German lady." "Oh, really?" "No one could be more patriotic than I am. I'm English through and through, but at the beginning of the war my poor wife had a very rough time in England.
Everyone thought she was a spy. It'll make you laugh when you know her. She's the typical German Hausfrau, who cares for nothing but her house, her husband, and our only child, Fritzi."
Capor fondled his dog.
"Yes, Fritzi, you are our child, aren't you? Naturally, it made my position very awkward. I'm a journalist, and my editors weren't quite comfortable about it. Well, to cut a long story short, I thought the most dignified course was to resign and come to a neutral country till the storm blew over. By the way, I don't know if you know my name. Grantley Capor."
"My name's Somerville," said Ashenden. He told him then about his work in the censorship department, and moved on to say that he was looking for someone to give him conversation lessons in German. As he spoke, he saw that it occurred to Capor that it would be a very good plan for Ashenden's teacher to be his wife. However, nothing was said, and at that moment Mrs. Capor came downstairs, and her husband joined her. They walked down the road, Fritzi bounding round them, and Ashenden saw that Capor immediately began to speak animatedly. That evening Ashenden went into dinner as the Capors were finishing. On their way out of the dining-room, Capor stopped and asked him if he'd drink coffee with them. When Ashenden joined them in the hall, Capor got up and introduced him to his wife. She bowed stiffly in response to Ashenden's civil greeting. Mrs. Capor was a plainish woman, nearing 40, with a muddy skin and vague features. She was squarely built, plump rather than fat, but looked a woman of character. "I have not told you, my dear," said Capor, "that Mr. Somerville is looking for someone to give him conversation lessons. I said perhaps that you could suggest a teacher." "I know no one I could conscientiously recommend," she answered. "The Swiss accent is hateful beyond words. It could do Mr. Somerville only harm to converse with a Swiss." "If I were in your place, Mr. Somerville," said Capor, "I'd try to persuade my wife to give you lessons. She is, if I may say so, a very cultivated and highly educated woman." "Ach, Grantley, I have not the time. I have my own work to do." Ashenden saw that the trap was prepared, and all he had to do was fall in. He turned to Mrs. Capor with a manner that he tried to make deprecating and modest. "I should look upon it as a real privilege if you would give me lessons. Naturally, I wouldn't want to interfere with your work. I'm just here to get well, with nothing in the world to do, and I would suit my time entirely to your convenience." He felt a flash of satisfaction pass from one to the other. "Of course, it would be a purely business arrangement," said Capor. "There's no reason why my good wife shouldn't earn a little pin money. Would you think 10 francs an hour too much?" "I'd think myself lucky to get a first-rate teacher for that." "What do you say, my dear? Surely you can spare an hour, and you would be doing this gentleman a kindness. He would learn that all Germans are not the devilish fiends that they think them in England." She made a visible effort. "I shall be very pleased to give Mr. Somerville conversation lessons." It was agreed that the lessons would start at 11 the following morning. Mrs. Capor had clearly agreed to the arrangement under protest, but she was a born teacher, and as the hour progressed, it was clear that she meant to do her job conscientiously. And indeed she gave her lessons with the greatest thoroughness. But every day she came with the same sullen face, and it was only her interest in teaching that allowed her to lose for a moment her instinctive dislike of him. Mrs. Capor was a fanatic. Obsessed with the superiority of all things German, she loathed England with a virulent hatred. Her ideal was a world ruled by Germany, in which the rest of the nations would enjoy the benefits of German science and German culture. As to her relationship with her husband, Ashenden divined that this unprepossessing woman and that mean, fat man were joined together by a deep and sincere love. It seemed to him that Mrs. Capor loved her husband because she'd made him what he was. She loved him notwithstanding his weakness, for given her clear head, she must always have been conscious of that. But then there was the espionage. To betray your country for money is not a very pretty proceeding. How had she persuaded herself into forcing her husband to adopt so dishonourable a calling? Grantley Capor was another story. There was little to admire in that gross and vulgar fellow. Ashenden watched with entertainment the way in which the spy tried to inveigle him in his toils. It was a couple of days after his first lesson that Capor, after dinner, his wife having gone upstairs, threw himself heavily into a chair by Ashenden's side. His faithful Fritzi came up to him and put his long muzzle with its black nose on his knee. "Have you had him long?" asked Ashenden. "I got him just before the outbreak of war. By the way, what do you think of the news today? Of course, my wife and I never discuss the war. You can't think what a relief to me it is to find a fellow countryman to whom I can speak freely. It's the greatest grief of my life that, owing to my wife's nationality, I was unable to do any war work. I don't mind telling you, if the war goes on much longer, wife or no wife, I'm going to do something. With my knowledge of languages, I ought to be of some service in the censorship department. That's where you were, wasn't it?" That was the mark at which he'd been aiming, and Ashenden now passed on certain information already prepared, which could be of no value at all to the Central Powers. When they parted, both had reason to be satisfied. Ashenden guessed that Capor's typewriter would be kept busy next morning, and that the extremely energetic Major in Bern would shortly receive a most interesting report. The following Sunday, Capor told Ashenden that he and his wife were going on an excursion and would have lunch at some little mountain restaurant. He suggested that Ashenden should come with them. They started early, Mrs. Capor businesslike in her walking boots, Tyrolese hat and alpenstock, and Capor in stockings and +4s, looking very British. They reached the inn with its view of the mountains and the lake, and lunched deliciously off scrambled eggs and mountain trout. Even Mrs. Capor was moved to an unwonted gentleness by her surroundings. Softened perhaps, too, by food and drink, her eyes, dwelling on the grandeur before her, filled with tears. She stretched out her hand. "Despite this horrible and unjust war, I can feel in my heart at the moment nothing but happiness and gratitude." Capor took her hand and pressed it, and an unusual thing with him, addressing her in German, called her little pet names. It was absurd, but touching. Ashenden, leaving them to their emotions, strolled through the garden and sat down on a bench. The view was spectacular. As Ashenden lingered in that spot, he pondered over the mystery of Grantley Capor's treachery. He didn't think Capor had become a spy merely for the money. He was a man of modest tastes. Perhaps he'd turned spy not from hatred of the country that had imprisoned him, nor even from love of his wife, but from a desire to score off the bigwigs who never even knew of his existence. Perhaps he felt that his talents hadn't received the recognition they merited, or perhaps it was just an impish desire to do mischief. One thing was clear. Capor was disturbed by no gnawing of conscience. He did his mean and despicable work with gusto. He was a traitor who enjoyed his treachery. Ashenden knew that R would have said to him, "Why the devil waste your time with idle speculations? The man's a dangerous spy, and your business is to lay him by the heels." True enough. Ashenden had decided that it would be useless to attempt to make any arrangement with Capor. He could certainly not be trusted. His wife's influence was too strong. So Capor must be caught. But how was he to effect that? All he could do was wait, with his eyes open, to seize any opportunity that might present itself. A couple of days later, an incident occurred that made him certain something was in the wind. In the course of his morning lesson, Mrs. Capor remarked, "My husband has gone to Geneva today. He had some business to do there." Not everyone can tell a lie, and Ashenden had the feeling that Mrs. Capor was telling one then. It flashed across his mind that Capor had been summoned to Bern to see the redoubtable head of the German Secret Service. Ashenden knew in Lucerne a Swiss who was willing to do odd jobs in an emergency. Looking him up, Ashenden asked him to take a letter to Bern. It might be possible to pick up Capor and trace his movements. Next day, Capor appeared once more with his wife at the dinner table, but merely nodded to Ashenden. Afterwards, both went straight upstairs. They looked troubled. The following morning, Ashenden received a reply to his letter. Capor had seen Major von Posen. Ashenden guessed what the Major had said to him. They were tired of paying Capor a salary to sit still in Lucerne and do nothing. The time had come for him to go to England. Guesswork? Of course it was guesswork, but in that trade it mostly was. Ashenden knew from R that the Germans wanted to send someone to England. He drew a long breath. If Capor went, he'd have to get busy. When Mrs. Capor came in to give him his lesson, she was dull and listless. At luncheon they hardly spoke to one another. They left early, but when Ashenden went out, he saw Capor sitting in the hall by himself. "Hello," he cried. "How are you getting on? I've been to Geneva." "So I heard," said Ashenden. "Come and have your coffee with me. My poor wife's got a headache. I told her she'd better go and lie down. The fact is, she's rather worried, poor dear. I'm thinking of going to England." Ashenden's heart gave a sudden leap. "Oh, are you going for long? We shall miss you. To tell you the truth, I'm fed up with doing nothing. I can't sit here indefinitely. I can't afford it. I may have a German wife, but I am an Englishman, hang it all, and I want to do my bit. I could never face my friends again if I just stayed here in comfort till the end of the war." Ashenden saw in Capor's eyes that he didn't want to go to England. He'd wanted his wife to press him to stay, but it was plain she hadn't done that. Perhaps he hadn't dared tell her how frightened he was. To her he'd always been bold, adventurous, devil-may-care. Now, the prisoner of his own lies, he hadn't found it in him to confess himself the coward he was. "Are you going to take your wife with you?" asked Ashenden. "No, she'll stay here." It had been arranged very neatly. Mrs. Capor would receive his letters and forward the information they contained to Bern. "I've been out of England so long that I don't quite know how to set about getting war work. I wonder if there's anyone in the censorship department that you could give me a letter of introduction to." It was only by a miracle that Ashenden saved himself from showing what had just dawned on him. None of this was due to his own cleverness. He'd been a pawn, put in Lucerne, told how to describe himself, and given the proper information, so that what had occurred should occur. It was a trap set by that devilish R, and the grim Major at Bern had fallen into it. Ashenden had done his work just by sitting still and doing nothing. He almost laughed as he thought what a fool R had made of him. "I was on very good terms with the chief of my department," he said. "I could give you a note to him, if you liked." "That would be just the thing." Later, Ashenden prepared various communications. In one, he informed R that Capor was going to England. In another, he made arrangements through Bern that wherever Capor applied for a visa, it should be granted without question. When he went down to dinner, he handed Capor a cordial letter of introduction. Next day but one, Capor left Lucerne. Ashenden waited. He continued to have his hour's lesson with Mrs. Capor. After his lesson, Ashenden went every morning to Cook's to ask for his letters. Presently he received one from the consul in Geneva to say that Capor had applied there for his visa and had set out for France. That afternoon Ashenden asked Mrs. Capor, "Have you had news of Herr Capor?" "No, I suppose I could hardly expect to yet." Next day, during the lesson, he could see how impatient she was to have done with it. The first post was delivered at Cook's at noon, and at 2:05 she looked at her watch. Though Ashenden knew very well that no letter would ever come for her, he hadn't the heart to keep her on tenterhooks. "Don't you think that's enough for the day? I'm sure you want to go down to Cook's." When a little later he went there himself, he found her standing in the middle of the office, her face distraught. My husband promised to write from Paris. I'm sure there is a letter for me, but these stupid people say there's nothing. They're so careless." She turned and walked rapidly away. Fritzi followed her, his tail between his legs. There was no doubt of it. Already the fear had seized her that something was wrong. Next morning she looked dreadful. "You must excuse me, Herr Somerville. I cannot give you a lesson today. I'm not feeling well." That evening he got a note from her to say that she regretted that she must discontinue giving him conversation lessons. She gave no reason. Ashenden saw no more of her. She ceased coming into meals. Except to go morning and afternoon to Cook's, she apparently spent the whole day in her room. Ashenden thought of her sitting there, hour after hour, with that hideous fear gnawing at her heart. Who could help feeling sorry for her? The time hung heavy on his hands, too, until one morning the clerk at Cook's handed him a letter. It was from R. "Dear Sir, the goods dispatched by you from Lucerne have been duly delivered. We are obliged to you for executing our instructions with such promptness." R. was exultant. Ashenden guessed that Capor had been arrested, and by now had paid the penalty of his crime. That afternoon Ashenden went to Cook's, and, obedient to his orders, bought himself a ticket for Geneva. As he was waiting for his change, Mrs. Capor came in. He was shocked at the sight of her. She was blousy and dishevelled, and there were heavy rings round her eyes. She was deathly pale. She staggered up to the desk and asked for a letter. The clerk shook his head. "I'm sorry, madame, there's nothing yet." "But look, look! Are you sure? Please look again." The misery in her face was heartrending. With a shrug, the clerk took out the letters from a pigeonhole and sorted them once more. "No, there's nothing, madame." She gave a cry of despair and turned away, the tears streaming from her eyes. Then a fearful thing happened. Fritzi, the bull terrier, sat down on his haunches, threw back his head, and gave a long, melancholy howl. Mrs. Capor looked at him with terror. The gnawing doubt that had tortured her during those dreadful days of suspense was a doubt no longer. She knew. When Ashenden went on deck one spring day in 1917 and saw before him a low-lying coast and a white town, he felt a pleasant flutter of excitement. Vladivostok. From here he was to take the Trans-Siberian Railway to Petrograd. It was the most important mission he'd ever had. No one to give him orders and unlimited funds. He carried in a belt next to his skin bills of exchange for a sum so enormous that he was staggered when he thought of them. And though he'd been set to do something that was beyond human possibility, he didn't know this, and was prepared to set about his task with confidence. When they docked, a young man, small and with a mop of untidy hair, came up to him and asked if his name was Ashenden. "Mine is Benedict. I'm the interpreter at the British consulate. I've been told to look after you. We've got you a place on the Petrograd train tonight, and I've got a travelling companion for you. He's a man called Harrington, an American. He's going to Petrograd to try to fix some deal with the provisional government." When they arrived at the station at around midnight, most of the carriages were already filled to overflowing. As the porter stowed his luggage, Ashenden shook hands with his travelling companion. Mr. John Quincy Harrington was a thin man of somewhat less than middle height. He had a bony face, with large, pale blue eyes, and when he took off his hat to wipe his brow, he showed a large, bald skull. He wore a bowler hat, a black coat and waistcoat, and a pair of striped trousers. Ashenden didn't know precisely how you should dress for an 11-day journey across Siberia, but he couldn't help thinking that Mr. Harrington's costume was eccentric. When you're shut up with a man for 11 days in a railway carriage, you can hardly fail to learn something about him. Ashenden thought he'd never known as much about anyone as he knew about Mr. Harrington, and not only about him, but about his wife and his wife's family, his children and their schoolfellows, and his employers. For Mr. Harrington was a talker. He went on and on. He was like a stream of lava pouring irresistibly down the side of a volcano. Mr. Harrington was also very fond of reading aloud. Ashenden liked neither reading aloud nor being read aloud to, but the immortal gods love a good laugh at the expense of human beings. They now delivered him, bound and helpless, to the knife of the high priest. He'd take you unawares. "You must listen to this," he'd say. "It's only 3 lines." He read them, but having finished them, without pausing for a moment to take breath, he went on, page after page. The train trundled through the interminable steppes of Siberia, and Mr. Harrington went on and on. It was only when he was dressing that Mr. Harrington was silent, for then his maidenly mind was occupied with the problem of changing his clothes before Ashenden without indelicacy. He was extremely modest. He changed his linen every day, neatly taking it out of his suitcase and neatly putting back what was soiled. But he performed miracles of dexterity in order not to show an inch of bare skin during the process. When at last Ashenden, tired and dirty, and Mr. Harrington, neat, sprightly, and sententious, reached the outskirts of Petrograd, Mr. Harrington turned to him. "Well, I never would have thought the time would pass so quickly. We must see as much of one another as we can while I'm in Petrograd." "I shall have a great deal to do," said Ashenden. "My time won't be altogether my own." An hour later, Ashenden found himself alone in his hotel bedroom. But he was soon visited by 3 men. He knew them by sight, since they travelled in the same ship with him from San Francisco to Yokohama, although, following instructions, no communication had passed between them. They were Czechs, exiled from their country for their revolutionary activity, and long settled in America. They'd been sent over to Russia to help Ashenden in his mission. Their chief was a certain Dr. Egon Orth, a tall, thin man who'd arrived in Petrograd a week before, and now gave Ashenden his view of the situation. It seemed to Ashenden critical. The army was dissatisfied and mutinous. The government, under the weak Kerensky, was tottering. Famine was staring the country in the face. Clearly, if anything was to be done, it had to be done quickly. The ambassadors of Great Britain and the United States had been apprised of Ashenden's coming, but his mission was secret even from them. Knowing that Mr. Harrington needed an interpreter, he arranged for Dr. Orth to offer the American his services. But there was another person Ashenden felt might be useful to him. "Have you ever heard of a woman called Anastasia Alexandrovna Leonidov? She's the daughter of Alexander Denisiev." "I know all about him, of course," said Dr. Orth. "I believe she's in Petrograd," said Ashenden. "Will you find out where she lives and what she's doing?" A short time later, wallowing in soapy water, he considered the grim pleasantry of his relations with Anastasia Alexandrovna Leonidov. Anastasia was the daughter of a revolutionary who'd escaped from Siberia after being sentenced to penal servitude for life and had settled in England. An able man, he'd supported himself for 30 years by his pen. When his daughter reached a suitable age,
She'd married Vladimir Semenovich Leonidov, also an exile from his native country. It was some years later that Ashenden made her acquaintance. At the time, Europe was discovering Russia. Russian novelists, Russian dancers, Russian composers captivated the civilized world. Ashenden fell like the rest, hung an icon on the wall, read Chekhov, and went to the ballet. Anastasia Alexandrovna lived with her husband in a tiny house near Regent's Park, and here the literary folk in London might gaze reverentially at pale-faced, bearded giants, revolutionaries to a man, and not in the mines of Siberia by a miracle. You might shake hands there with Diaghilev, and now and again Pavlova wafted in and out. Ashenden was thrilled. In Anastasia's melancholy eyes, he saw the boundless steppes of Russia. He soon discovered that her husband was quite unworthy of her, and presently learned that she shared his opinion. Vladimir Semenovich was a gentle, unobtrusive creature, amiable and obliging. When in due course Ashenden disclosed his passion to Anastasia, and to his joy found it was returned, he was puzzled to know what to do about Vladimir.
Would Vladimir let himself be divorced, do you think? Vladimir adores me, she said. But of course he wouldn't want to stand in the way of my happiness. He'll give my freedom without question.
At that time the divorce law in England was complicated and absurd, and Ashenden explained the difficulties. She put her hand gently on his.
Vladimir would never expose me to the vulgar notoriety of the divorce court. When I tell him that I have decided to marry you, he'll commit suicide.
Ashenden was startled, but thrilled. It really was very much like the pages of a Russian novel, all very dreadful and wonderful and shattering. These Russians, what fun they have! Wiping her eyes, for tears were coursing down her face, Anastasia turned to him.
We must be quite sure we are doing the right thing. I should never forgive myself if I'd allowed Vladimir to commit suicide and then found I'd made a mistake. Let's go over to Paris for a week. It's impossible to know what a man is really like till you've lived with him.
Ashenden was a trifle conventional, and the suggestion took him by surprise, but only for a moment.
What a splendid idea!
They stayed in a little hotel on the left bank. Anastasia said it had atmosphere. She couldn't bear those grand hotels on the other side. They were hopelessly vulgar and bourgeois. That first night they talked into the early hours about Gorky and Karl Marx, human destiny, love and the brotherhood of man, and drank innumerable cups of Russian tea, so that in the morning Ashenden would willingly have breakfasted in bed and got up for luncheon. But Anastasia was an early riser. They sat down in a dingy dining room, and Anastasia ordered scrambled eggs. The following morning she ordered scrambled eggs again. When she did so on the third, Ashenden's heart sank.
But we had scrambled eggs yesterday, and the day before. I eat scrambled eggs every day. It's the only way I like them.
All right, I'll order them for you. I'll have mine fried. The smile vanished from her lips.
Isn't that rather inconsiderate? Do you think it's fair to give the cook unnecessary work? You English, you're all the same. You look upon servants as machines. How can you be surprised that the proletariat are seething with discontent when the bourgeoisie like you are so monstrously selfish?
Ashenden was astonished. Do you really think there'll be a revolution in England if I have my eggs in Paris fried rather than scrambled? She tossed her pretty head.
It's the principle of the thing. Your whole attitude is wrong. You wouldn't talk like that if you'd been through the events of 1905 in Petersburg. When I think of the crowds in front of the Winter Palace kneeling in the snow while the Cossacks charged them, women and children. No, no, no.
Her eyes filled with tears. She took Ashenden's hand.
I know you have a good heart. It was just thoughtless on your part. You'll have your eggs done in the same way as mine, won't you?
"Of course," said Ashenden. At the end of the week, they returned to London. When they arrived at Victoria and stood on the platform waiting for a cab, she looked at him with her round, shining eyes. "We've had a wonderful time, haven't we?" "Wonderful. I've quite made up my mind. The experiment has justified itself. I'm willing to marry you whenever you like." But Ashenden saw himself eating scrambled eggs every morning for the rest of his life. When he put her in a cab, he called another for himself, went to the Cunard office, and took a berth on the first ship to America. Some years had passed since then. Ashenden knew that on the outbreak of the revolution in March, she and Vladimir had gone to Russia. Perhaps they could help him. In a way, Vladimir owed him his life, and he made up his mind to write to Anastasia to ask if he might see her. When Ashenden went down to lunch, he found Mr. Harrington waiting for him. They sat down, and in a little while Dr. Egon Orth came in and gave Ashenden an envelope on which was written Anastasia's address. After luncheon, Ashenden wrote her a note, and presently received an answer to say that she'd look in at his hotel about 7. She arrived at 8:30, and he suggested she join Mr. Harrington and him at dinner. A third party, he thought, would prevent any awkwardness. He need have had no anxiety. 5 minutes after they'd sat down, it was clear that Anastasia's feelings towards him were as cool as his were towards her. He asked after Vladimir Semenovich. "He's been a disappointment to me. I never thought him clever, but I did think him honest. He's going to have a baby." Mr. Harrington, about to put a piece of fish into his mouth, stopped, his fork in the air. Ashenden, also perplexed, gave her a questioning look. "I'm not the mother," she explained. "I'm not interested in that sort of thing. The mother's a friend of mine and a well-known writer on political economy." She turned to Mr. Harrington. "Are you interested in political economy?" For once in his life, Mr. Harrington was speechless. After dinner, Ashenden told Mr. Harrington that he wished to talk business with Anastasia, and took her to a corner of the lounge. He told her all he thought necessary, and found her anxious to help. She had a passion for intrigue. When he hinted that he had command of large sums of money, she saw at once that through him she might acquire an influence in the affairs of Russia. When they parted, they'd come to a working agreement. Next morning at breakfast, Mr. Harrington said, "That was a very remarkable woman." "Don't fall in love with her," smiled Ashenden. This, however, wasn't a matter on which Mr. Harrington was prepared to jest. "I've never looked at a woman since I married Mrs. Harrington." With Anastasia to help him, and Dr. Orth in the background, Ashenden set to work. Things in Russia were going from bad to worse, what with the food and fuel shortages, while in the background Lenin and the Bolsheviks were active. It amused Ashenden to observe Mr. Harrington going about his own business while history was in the making. He paid bribes to underlings to be granted the ear of great men. He was kept waiting for hours in antechambers, and when at last he saw the great men, they made him promises which, in a day or two, he discovered meant nothing. Ashenden advised him to throw in his hand and return to America. But Mr. Harrington wouldn't hear of it. His firm had sent him to do a particular job, and by gum he was going to do it or perish in the attempt. Then Anastasia took him in hand. A strange friendship had arisen between the pair. Mr. Harrington said Anastasia Alexandrovna was too much of a mouthful, so he called her Delilah. And now she placed her inexhaustible energy at his service, and they went together to the persons who might be useful to him. Then, one day when Ashenden was working in his room, there was a knock at the door, and Anastasia stalked in, followed somewhat sheepishly by Mr. Harrington. "Unless this man goes back to America," she said, "he'll get killed. If I hadn't been there, something very unpleasant might have happened to him." "What's this all about?" asked Ashenden. "I taken Mr. Harrington to see Dostoevsky's grave, and on our way back we saw a soldier being rather rough with an old woman."
"Rather rough?" cried Mr. Harrington. "There was an old woman walking along the pavement with a basket of provisions on her arm. 2 soldiers came up behind her, and one of them snatched the basket from her and walked off with it. She burst out screaming and crying, and the other soldier hit her over the head with the butt of his gun." "And before I could prevent it," said Anastasia, "Mr. Harrington jumped out of the cab, ran up to the soldier who had the basket, wrenched it from him, and began to abuse the pair of them like pickpockets. At first they were so taken aback they didn't know what to do, and then they got in a rage. I ran after Mr. Harrington and explained to them that he was a foreigner and drunk." She turned to him in a sudden fury. "Don't you know those soldiers might very easily have killed you, and me too, and not one of the bystanders would have raised a finger to help us." "Me? I'm an American citizen, Delilah. They wouldn't dare touch a hair on my head." "If you think Russian soldiers are going to hesitate to kill you because you're an American citizen, you'll get a big surprise one of these days." At length, Ashenden devised a plan of campaign. It took him 24 hours' hard work to encode a telegram in which he put his scheme before the persons who'd sent him to Petrograd. It was accepted, and he was promised all the money he needed. Ashenden knew he could do nothing unless the provisional government remained in power for another 3 months. But winter was at hand, and food was getting scarcer every day. The army was mutinous. The people clamoured for peace. Anastasia had a flat in a sheltered spot, and here Ashenden had meetings with all manner of persons. Plans were drawn up while he curbed his impatience with Russian verbosity. Then the blow fell. On the night of November the 7th, 1917, the Bolsheviks rose. Kerensky's ministers were arrested, the Winter Palace was sacked by the mob, and the reins of power were seized by Lenin and Trotsky. Anastasia came to Ashenden's room at the hotel early in the morning, her face white, her shining brown eyes tragic. "Have you heard?" He nodded. "It's all over then. They say Kerensky has fled. The buffoon." At that moment there was a knock at the door. Anastasia looked at it with sudden apprehension. "You know the Bolsheviks have got a list of people they've decided to execute. My name is on it, and it may be that yours is too." Ashenden had an odd feeling at the pit of his stomach, but he called, "Come in." Mr. Harrington stepped into the room as dapper as ever. He beamed on them, the picture of self-satisfaction. "I wanted to tell you my news. You must both congratulate me. I got my signatures yesterday, and my business is done." Anastasia burst into a sudden shriek of hysterical laughter. He stared at her. "Why, Delilah, what's the matter?" Ashenden explained. "The Bolsheviks have overthrown the government. Kerensky's ministers are in prison. Your contracts are worth nothing. The Bolsheviks are going to make peace with Germany as soon as they can." Anastasia had recovered her self-control as quickly as she'd lost it. "You'd better get out of Russia as soon as you can, Mr. Harrington. In a few days you may not be able to." Mr. Harrington stared at the floor. His pride in this achievement of his was shattered, and he sagged like a pricked balloon. But in a minute he looked up. He gave Anastasia a smile. "Don't you think you'd better come with me to America? I'm sure Mrs. Harrington would be glad to do anything she could for you." Anastasia laughed. "I can see Mrs. Harrington's face if you arrived in Philadelphia with a Russian refugee. I'm afraid it would need more explaining than you could ever manage. No, I shall stay here. I'm a Russian. My place is here. I will not leave my country when my country needs me most." "Go along and do your packing, Mr. Harrington," said Ashenden, "and then we'll take you to the station. The train will be besieged." "Very well. And I shan't be sorry to go, either. I haven't had a decent meal since I came here. Mrs. Harrington will never believe me when I tell her what I've gone through. What this country wants is organization."
When he'd left them, Ashenden and Anastasia talked over the situation. Ashenden was depressed because all his careful schemes had come to nothing, but Anastasia Alexandrovna was excited. She looked upon it all as a thrilling play. She wanted more and more things to happen. Then there was another knock at the door, and before Ashenden could answer, Mr. Harrington burst in. "Really, the service at this hotel is a scandal. I've been ringing my bell for 15 minutes, and I can't get anyone to pay the smallest attention to me." "Service!" exclaimed Anastasia. "There isn't a servant left in the hotel." "But I want my laundry. They promised to let me have it back last night." "I'm afraid," said Ashenden, "you haven't got much chance of getting it now." "I'm not going to leave without my laundry. 4 shirts, 2 sets of combinations, a pair of pajamas, and 4 collars. I want my laundry, and I'm not leaving this hotel without it." "Don't be a fool," cried Ashenden. "You must get out of here while the going's good. If there are no servants to get it, you'll just have to leave your washing behind you." "Pardon me, sir, I shall do nothing of the kind. I'll go and fetch it myself. I've suffered enough at the hands of this country, and I'm not going to leave 4 perfectly good shirts to be worn by a lot of dirty Bolsheviks. No, sir, I do not leave Russia till I have my laundry." Anastasia looked up at him with a little smile. There was something in her that responded to Mr. Harrington's futile obstinacy. In her Russian way, she understood that Mr. Harrington could not leave Petrograd without his washing. "I'll go downstairs and see if I can find anybody about who knows where the laundry is, and I'll go with you to fetch it." Mr. Harrington answered with that sweet and disarming smile of his. "That's terribly kind of you, Delilah. I don't mind if it's ready or not. I'll take it just as it is." Anastasia left them, only to return in a few minutes to say that she'd found the address. "It's about 40 minutes' walk from here. If you come now, I'll go with you." They set out, and Ashenden went on with the dreary business of translating into a very complicated code the shattering news he had to give. Suddenly his door was burst open, and Anastasia flung into the room. She'd lost her hat and was obviously in a state of great excitement. "Isn't Mr. Harrington here?" "No." "Is he in his bedroom?" "I don't know. We'll go and look if you like." They walked down the passage and knocked at Mr. Harrington's door. There was no answer. They tried the handle. The door was locked. They went back to Ashenden's room. Anastasia sank into a chair. "I hope he's all right. I was hoping he'd get here before me. We found the place. He got his washing all right. Mr. Harrington was furious because it hadn't been touched. We started to come back again. He passed the top of a street, and at the bottom of it I saw a little crowd. There was a man addressing them. I wanted to know what was happening, so I said, 'Let's go and hear what he's saying.' 'Come along, Delilah,' he said. 'Let us mind our own business.' 'You go back to the hotel,' I said, 'and do your packing. I'm going to see the fun.' Suddenly we heard the sound of shots, and before you could realize what was happening, 2 armored cars came dashing down the street. There were soldiers in them, and they were firing as they went. We all scattered like a lot of rabbits. We just ran for our lives. I lost Mr. Harrington. I can't make out why he isn't here. Do you think something has happened to him?" "We'd better go out and look for him," said Ashenden. He put on his hat and coat, and they went out. The silence in the great city was uncanny. The shops were closed. There was hardly anyone to be seen. But when they had to go through a main thoroughfare, they found a lot of people simply standing about. Then they came to the street down which Anastasia had run. Sitting on the pavement, her head bent down to her lap, was a woman. She was dead. A little way on, 2 men had fallen together. They, too, were dead. Then they found Mr. Harrington. He lay on his face, in a pool of blood, his bald head very white, his neat black coat smeared and muddy. But his hand was clenched tight on the parcel that contained 4 shirts, 2 pairs of combinations,
a pair of pyjamas, and 4 collars. Mr. Harrington had not let his washing go.